Miss Marple and the Knitting Needle Murder. Chapter 1. Tuesday's Knitting Circle. The village of St. Mary Mead was in quite a flutter. It was not often that a new resident of any significance moved into their midst, let alone one who purchased Gossington Hall. Since the Bantrys had decided to sell the old place and move to a more manageable property by the seaside, there had been considerable speculation as to who might take it on. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had arrived with little fanfare, but considerable style. A handsome widow of perhaps 55 or 60, she possessed that particular kind of elegance that speaks of money worn with comfortable familiarity rather than ostentatious display. Her silver-grey hair was impeccably styled, her clothes were of excellent quality, and she spoke with the precise modulated tones of someone who had spent time on the stage. Within a fortnight of her arrival, invitations had been issued to a select group of ladies to attend a knitting circle at Gossington Hall. Miss Jane Marple, despite her advancing years, felt a small thrill of curiosity as she prepared for the gathering. She selected her finest knitting needles, silver ones that had been a gift from her nephew Raymond many Christmases ago, and packed her current work, a complicated pattern for a baby's shawl, into her bag. "Now, Florence," she said to her faithful maid, "I don't expect to be back until at least 5:30. Mrs. Blackwood has invited us for tea as well as knitting." The drawing-room at Gossington Hall had been transformed under Mrs. Blackwood's ownership. Gone were the Bantrys' comfortable but somewhat shabby furnishings, replaced by elegant pieces that somehow managed to make the room both more sophisticated and more welcoming. "Miss Marple? How delightful!" Mrs. Blackwood greeted her warmly. "I've heard so much about you from everyone in the village. They tell me nothing of note happens in St. Mary Mead without Miss Marple being aware of it." "Oh dear," Miss Marple flushed slightly. "People do exaggerate so. I'm just an old woman with perhaps too much time to observe her neighbours." Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was already there, her needles clicking away at what appeared to be a scarf in a rather sombre shade of green. Miss Weatherby, a fluttery spinster whose conversation consisted largely of exclamation marks, sat beside her, working on something formless in pale blue wool. They were soon joined by Miss Haydock, the doctor's sister, a tall, rather severe woman with iron-grey hair pulled back in an unflattering bun, and finally by young Philippa Hames, who had recently taken up residence in a cottage on the edge of the village and was establishing herself as a garden designer of some promise. Mrs. Blackwood proved to be a charming hostess, ensuring everyone's teacup remained filled and directing the conversation with gentle skill. It was only when the topic turned to the London theatre that a change came over her. "Oh, I do so miss the West End," sighed Miss Weatherby. "Such glamour, such excitement." "Indeed," said Mrs. Blackwood with a small enigmatic smile. "I was once part of that world, you know, an actress of some small renown, though under quite a different name." "How thrilling!" exclaimed Miss Weatherby. "Might we know the name? I think I shall keep that my little secret." "For now," replied Mrs. Blackwood. Her eyes travelled around the circle, pausing momentarily on each face. "We all have our secrets, don't we, even in a place as seemingly transparent as St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple, whose needles had been clicking steadily throughout the conversation, noticed how Mrs. Blackwood's gaze lingered on young Philippa Hames. The girl flushed slightly and bent her head over her work. "Some secrets," continued Mrs. Blackwood, "are best left undisturbed. Others—" She let the sentence trail off suggestively. The atmosphere in the room had subtly changed, becoming charged with an indefinable tension. As they were preparing to leave, Miss Marple observed another curious incident. Mrs. Blackwood handed Miss Haydock her coat with a peculiar look of recognition in her eyes. "I feel certain we must have met before, Miss Haydock. Your face is remarkably familiar to me." Miss Haydock stiffened slightly. "I don't believe so, Mrs. Blackwood. I rarely venture into society. You must be thinking of someone else." Miss Marple, whose innocent blue eyes missed very little, noted the tremor in Miss Haydock's hand as she fastened her coat. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's knitting circle promised to be far more interesting than anyone in St. Mary Mead might have anticipated. The tangled threads of human relationships, she reflected, so often resembled the complex patterns of her knitting, and sometimes those patterns could become dangerously snarled. Chapter 2. The Body in the Library. The morning after the knitting circle dawned with a fine autumn mist shrouding St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was attending to her garden, carefully tying back some late-blooming roses, when she heard the unmistakable sound of a police car coming down the lane. She straightened up, feeling that small, familiar flutter of apprehension. In a village as small as St. Mary Mead, the arrival of the police seldom boded well. From her vantage point, she could see the car stopping outside the vicarage. A few moments later, it moved on, stopping briefly at Dr. Haydock's house before proceeding in the direction of Gossington Hall. Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves and went inside to wash her hands. She had hardly finished when there was a knock at her door. Constable Park, looking distinctly uncomfortable, stood on her doorstep. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock sends his regards and wonders if you might be able to come to Gossington Hall. There's been a bit of trouble, ma'am." "Mrs. Blackwood?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The constable looked surprised. "Yes, ma'am. How did you know?" Miss Marple didn't explain the slight frisson she had felt the previous evening, nor the curious glances exchanged between Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Haydock. Instead, she merely said, "I'll get my hat and coat, constable." The scene at Gossington Hall was one of controlled chaos. Police cars lined the driveway, and several official-looking individuals were moving with purpose between the house and the gardens. Inspector Craddock, a tall, lean man with intelligent eyes, met Miss Marple at the door. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming. I know it's an imposition, but I value your insight in these matters." "Not at all, Inspector. I was acquainted with Mrs. Blackwood, although only slightly. How can I be of help?" "She was found this morning by her maid, Edith, in the library." There was the slightest emphasis on the last word which was not lost on Miss Marple. The library at Gossington Hall had been the scene of another body's discovery some years ago, during the time of the Bantries. The library was a handsome room, lined with bookshelves and featuring a large bay window that overlooked the rose garden. Miss Eleanor Blackwood sat in a comfortable armchair positioned near the window, her head slumped forward onto her chest. One might have thought she was merely dozing, were it not for the long silver knitting needle protruding from the base of her neck. Her knitting was still on her lap, the wool trailing down to a ball that had come to rest by her feet. "She was killed sometime last night, according to Dr. Haydock," Inspector Craddock explained. "Death would have been almost instantaneous. The needle was inserted with considerable precision into a vital spot." Miss Marple nodded gravely. Her eyes moved methodically around the room, taking in every detail. There was something not quite right about the scene, but she couldn't immediately identify what was troubling her. "I understand you were here yesterday afternoon, Miss Marple?" Well, Mrs. Blackwood had invited a group of ladies for a knitting circle. "Yes, that's correct. Mrs. Clement, Miss Weatherby, Miss Haydock, and young Philippa Hames were also present." "And was there anything unusual about the gathering? Any tension or disagreement?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Mrs. Blackwood did mention she had once been an actress of some renown, though she refused to share her stage name, and there was a curious moment when she appeared to recognize Miss Haydock, who denied any previous acquaintance. She paused, then added, "There was also a rather pointed comment about people with secrets while looking directly at Miss Hames." Inspector Craddock made a note of this. "Interesting. We've just learned that a gentleman arrived to visit Mrs. Blackwood last evening. Her nephew, Timothy Blackwood, who arrived unexpectedly from London, and apparently she had an appointment scheduled this morning with a Mr. Fitzwilliam." "Oh," Miss Marple exclaimed softly. her attention caught by something. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "The knitting," she said, moving closer to examine the work on Mrs. Blackwood's lap. "This is a most complex pattern, Inspector. It's known as the lover's knot. Yet yesterday Mrs. Blackwood was working on a simple scarf and mentioned that she wasn't familiar with complicated patterns. Yet this," she gestured to the intricate work, "this shows considerable skill and experience." Inspector Craddock looked interested but puzzled. "And her knitting bag," Miss Marple continued, pointing to a tapestry bag placed nearly beside the chair. "It's been arranged most meticulously. That's not at all what one would expect in a struggle or attack." The inspector bent to examine the bag. "You're suggesting the scene was arranged after her death?" "It seems possible," Miss Marple replied. "There's also," she broke off, looking more closely at Mrs. Blackwood. "She was wearing a cameo brooch yesterday, Inspector. Quite distinctive, set in silver with a dark blue background. It appears to be missing." A commotion at the door drew their attention. A young, well-dressed man in his early 30s burst into the room, his face pale with shock. "What's happened? Where's my aunt? I was told—" He stopped abruptly at the sight of Mrs. Blackwood's body, his expression a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Mr. Timothy Blackwood, I presume?" Inspector Craddock asked. "I'm afraid I must ask you to step outside, sir. This is a crime scene." As the distraught young man was led away, the inspector turned back to Miss Marple. "We'll need to question everyone who was present yesterday, as well as the staff and this nephew, and I believe the gardener had some kind of disagreement with Mrs. Blackwood about changes to the rose garden." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Inspector, there's one more thing that strikes me as odd." Mrs. Blackwood's hands. The inspector looked down at the dead woman's hands, still holding the knitting needles. "What about them? If she was knitting when she was attacked from the front, as the angle of the needle suggests, wouldn't there have been some defensive movement? Yet her hands appear perfectly positioned, as if she continued knitting even as she was being murdered." Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed, suggesting she either knew and trusted her killer, or she was already dead when the scene was arranged. Miss Marple finished quietly. As she left Gossington Hall, Miss Marple's mind was already busy sorting through the tangled threads of this new mystery. Like a complex knitting pattern, the solution would require patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of the underlying structure. And somewhere among the stitches lay the identity of a killer. Chapter 3. Unraveling the Past. The morning following the discovery of Mrs. Blackwood's body, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she contemplated the events of the previous day. The village was already buzzing with the news, embellished versions of the story circulating with remarkable speed. Her telephone rang, breaking her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might call on you this morning. There have been some developments in the case." 10 minutes later, Inspector Craddock was seated in Miss Marple's parlour, accepting a cup of tea. "We've managed to establish Mrs. Blackwood's identity," he began. "She was indeed once an actress, as she claimed. Elaine Blackwood was quite well known in theatrical circles some 20 years ago." "Ah," said Miss Marple, her needles pausing momentarily. "I thought the name sounded familiar. Wasn't there some scandal? I recall reading about it in the newspapers." Inspector Craddock looked impressed. "Exactly so. She was involved with a married director, a man named Richard Hames. The affair ended abruptly when he committed suicide, leaving behind a wife and young daughter. Elaine Blackwood retired from the stage immediately afterward and has lived quietly ever since, though apparently quite comfortably." "Hames," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Like our young garden designer, Philippa Hames." "Indeed, we're looking into whether there's any connection." Meanwhile, Miss Haydock has suddenly announced plans to return to London. Claims she's received an urgent message from a friend, though she's been rather vague about the details. Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Has she indeed? Most curious. considering Mrs. Blackwood seemed to recognize her. We've also found something rather disturbing among Mrs. Blackwood's papers. A torn letter with phrases like "your secret" and "substantial compensation for my silence." It appears she may have been blackmailing someone. "Oh dear," murmured Miss Marple. "That does cast rather a different light on things. The nephew Timothy Blackwood claims to know nothing about any blackmail. Says he rarely saw his aunt and only came down because she had telephoned, sounding distressed and asking him to visit urgently." The inspector sighed. "And we've identified the mysterious Mr. Fitzwilliam. He's a solicitor from London who claims Mrs. Blackwood had summoned him to change her will." "Did he say why?" "Only that she had expressed fear for her safety, but refused to elaborate. Apparently, she told him she would explain everything when he arrived." After the inspector left, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind working as swiftly as her fingers. The scandal involving Elaine Blackwood and the director had been before Philippa Hames was born, or when she was very young. Yet Mrs. Blackwood had looked pointedly at her when speaking of secrets. And what of Miss Haydock's sudden departure? There was something there, something that tugged at Miss Marple's memory. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the church flower rota with Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife seemed distracted, her usual calm efficiency replaced by a nervous energy. "Such a dreadful business at Gossington Hall," Mrs. Clement said, her hands fidgeting with the teacups. "Who would have thought such a thing could happen in St. Mary Mead?" "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "though I've found that human nature is much the same everywhere. Even in our quiet village, passions can run deep." Mrs. Clement dropped a spoon with a clatter. "Yes, well, I suppose that's true." As they talked, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a collection of photographs on the mantelpiece. Among them was one she hadn't noticed before, a faded theatrical production shot. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized a much younger Miss Haydock standing beside a glamorous blonde woman who could only be Elaine Blackwood. "What an interesting photograph," she remarked casually. "Is that from Mr. Clement's collection?" Mrs. Clement glanced up, her face paling slightly. "Oh, that? Yes, my husband had an interest in the theatre in his younger days. Just an old program photograph." But Miss Marple had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. The tangled threads of the past were beginning to unravel, revealing a pattern that pointed toward a killer in their midst. Miss Marple and the Knitting Needle Murder. Chapter 4. The Cameo Brooch. The village of St. Mary Mead was in a state of subdued excitement. Murder was not a common occurrence, and the death of Mrs. Blackwood had provided ample material for speculation and gossip. Miss Marple, however, kept her own counsel, quietly continuing with her knitting and gardening, while her mind worked steadily on the problem. She was deadheading her late roses when Inspector Craddock's car pulled up outside her gate. He looked pleased with himself as he approached. "Good news, Miss Marple. We've had a break in the case. The missing cameo brooch you mentioned has been found." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's faded blue eyes showed keen interest. "Where was it discovered?" "In Timothy Blackwood's luggage, as he was preparing to return to London. He claims his aunt gave it to him as a gift, but given its sentimental value and the circumstances, we find that hard to believe. We've arrested him on suspicion of murder." Miss Marple frowned slightly. "That seems convenient, Inspector. You don't think he's guilty?" "I didn't say that," she replied carefully. "But in my experience, evidence that presents itself so neatly often deserves closer scrutiny." After the inspector left, Miss Marple considered this new development. The cameo brooch troubled her. It seemed too obvious, too contrived. If Timothy Blackwood had murdered his aunt and stolen her brooch, would he really have kept it in his luggage where it could easily be found? That evening, Miss Marple invited Miss Haydock to tea, catching her before her departure to London. The doctor's sister arrived looking tense and drawn, her usually severe appearance made harsher by evident strain. "I'm afraid I can't stay long, Miss Marple. My train leaves in 2 hours." "Oh, it won't take long," Miss Marple assured her, pouring tea. "I just thought we might have a little chat before you go. About the theatre, perhaps." Miss Haydock's hand trembled, rattling her cup against its saucer. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said gently. "I saw the photograph at the vicarage. You and Elaine Blackwood were in a production together, weren't you? That's why she recognized you." A long silence followed. Finally, Miss Haydock sighed deeply. "Yes, we knew each other. Many years ago. I was never as successful as Elaine, of course. I had small roles while she was destined for stardom. And Richard Hames, the director? Did you know him as well?" Miss Haydock's face tightened. Everyone knew Richard, brilliant, charming, and utterly amoral. What he did to Margaret was unforgivable. Margaret, his wife, she was devastated by the scandal. Disappeared afterward. I always wondered what became of her. After Miss Haydock left, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock. "Inspector, I wonder if you might join me at the vicarage tomorrow morning. I believe there's something important you should see." The following morning, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock sat in the vicar's study, examining the theatrical photograph. The vicar had reluctantly produced it after some gentle but persistent questioning. This was taken during a production of The Lover's Knot, a rather melodramatic play that was popular in its day. Miss Marple explained, "The same name as the knitting pattern Mrs. Blackwood was working on when she died." Inspector Craddock looked puzzled. "Are you suggesting there's a connection?" "I believe so. You see, this production is where Elaine Blackwood met Richard Hames, the director, who later committed suicide, and Miss Haydock was part of the same production." "But what does this have to do with Mrs. Clement?" Miss Marple paused. "Inspector, have you ever wondered about Mrs. Clement's background? She joined our community when the vicar married her, about 15 years ago. No one knows much about her life before that." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Miss Marple replied, "but I think we should look more closely at young Philippa Hames as well. Her surname can hardly be a coincidence." Later that day, the village was astir with news that Timothy Blackwood had been released from custody. Inspector Craddock, acting on Miss Marple's subtle prompting, had discovered that Mrs. Blackwood had indeed given her nephew the brooch the evening before her death. "She seemed troubled," Timothy told them, "said she wanted me to have it as a family keepsake, in case anything happened to her. She also mentioned a young woman who had been asking questions about her past." "Philippa Hames?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Timothy Blackwood nodded. "I believe that was the name. My aunt said she recognized her as someone's daughter, though she didn't explain further. She mentioned something about setting things right after all these years." The threads of the mystery were beginning to come together in Miss Marple's mind. But before she could share her thoughts with Inspector Craddock, Miss Weatherby arrived in a state of considerable agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple, the most extraordinary thing. I was taking my evening walk last Tuesday, you know, just as dusk was falling, and I'm certain I saw Miss Haydock entering Gossington Hall through the garden door. She seemed very secretive about it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, with everything that's happened, the case was drawing to its climax, and Miss Marple knew that soon the final stitch would be placed in this complex pattern of deception and murder." Chapter 5. The director's daughter. The following day brought steady rain to St. Mary Mead, the kind of persistent drizzle that seeps into bones and spirits alike. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, a small fire crackling in the grate, as she waited for Inspector Craddock. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, her mind too preoccupied with the tangled web of relationships surrounding the death of Mrs. Blackwood. The doorbell rang, and Miss Marple's maid Florence showed Inspector Craddock into the sitting room. He looked tired, raindrops glistening on his overcoat. "I've spoken with Philippa Hames," he said without preamble. "She's admitted to a connection with the case, though not to the murder." "I rather thought she might," Miss Marple murmured. Would you care to tell me what she said? It's quite extraordinary. She is indeed the daughter of Richard Hames, the director, who was involved with Elaine Blackwood. She was just a child when the scandal broke, and her father committed suicide. Her mother took her abroad afterward, and she was raised in Switzerland under her mother's maiden name. She only learned the full story when her mother died 2 years ago, and she came to St. Mary Mead deliberately to confront Mrs. Blackwood. Yes, she admits she sought work here specifically to be near Gossington Hall. She wanted to understand what really happened between her father and Elaine Blackwood. According to Philippa, she believed all these years that the scandal and Mrs. Blackwood's rejection drove her father to suicide. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Poor child. And did she confront Mrs. Blackwood directly? She says no. She was working up the courage to do so, but she admits to watching the house and making some discreet inquiries in the village. Mrs. Blackwood apparently recognized her. Philippa resembles her father strongly, and had realized who she was, hence the pointed comment about secrets at the knitting circle, Miss Marple said, and her statement to Timothy Blackwood about setting things right. Exactly, but here's what's particularly interesting. Philippa insists that Mrs. Blackwood had written her a note, asking to meet privately after the knitting circle. She says the note mentions the truth about your father's death, but Philippa claims she never went to that meeting. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Was this note found among Mrs. Blackwood's possessions? No, the inspector admitted. We found no trace of it. Most suggestive, Miss Marple murmured. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the rain pattern against the glass. Something was troubling her, a loose thread in the fabric of explanations that had been presented. She recalled Miss Weatherby's claim of seeing Miss Haydock entering Gossington Hall surreptitiously, and there was the matter of the photograph at the vicarage, and Mrs. Clement's curious reaction to it. Her telephone rang, startling her from her reverie. It was Timothy Blackwood's voice. I wonder if I might call on you this afternoon. There's something I think you should know. An hour later, Timothy Blackwood sat across from Miss Marple, a cup of tea cooling forgotten beside him. My aunt spoke to me at some length the evening before she died, he explained. She seemed deeply troubled. She said she had recognized someone from her past, 2 people, actually, and that old secrets were about to come to light. Did she name these people? Miss Marple asked gently. Not directly, but she mentioned the director's daughter and the wife who disappeared. She said she had been wrong about something all these years, and that it was time to make amends. Miss Marple's needles paused. The wife who disappeared, that would be Margaret Hames, I presume. I believe so. My aunt said she needed to set the record straight about what really happened 20 years ago. She seemed afraid. After Timothy Blackwood left, Miss Marple telephoned Dr. Haydock. I wonder, she asked carefully, how long your sister has been staying with you? About 3 weeks, he replied. Why do you ask? And has she been in the habit of taking evening walks? There was a slight pause. Yes, she often goes out after dinner, says she needs the exercise. Miss Marple, what are you getting at? I'm not entirely sure, she replied thoughtfully. But I believe there may be more to your sister's presence in St. Mary Mead than a simple family visit. That evening, Miss Marple paid a call on Miss Weatherby. The fluttery spinster was delighted to have a visitor, especially one who seemed eager to hear more about her observations regarding Miss Haydock's clandestine visit to Gossington Hall. It was most definitely her, Miss Weatherby insisted, though she was wearing a headscarf and walking very quickly. I wouldn't have recognized her at all if she hadn't stumbled slightly near the lamppost, and the light caught her face. And you're certain this was the evening before Mrs. Blackwood was found dead? Absolutely certain. It was my regular Tuesday constitutional, you see. I always walk past Gossington Hall on Tuesdays. As Miss Marple walked home through the damp evening, she felt the pattern of the case crystallizing in her mind. Like an intricate knitting design, The separate strands were beginning to form a coherent whole. There remained just a few more stitches to place before the truth would be revealed. She had nearly reached her cottage when she saw a figure hurrying toward the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, returning from some errand, her face partially obscured by an umbrella. There was something in her gait, a tenseness, that caught Miss Marple's attention. In that moment, illuminated briefly by a street lamp, Mrs. Clement's profile showed a striking resemblance to someone Miss Marple had seen before. The final piece clicked into place. With a sense of quiet certainty, Miss Marple knew exactly who had murdered Eleanor Blackwood, and why. Chapter 6. Miss Marple's revelation. The following day dawned clear and bright, the previous day's rain having washed the world clean. Miss Marple rose early, spending an hour in her garden before returning inside to make certain preparations. She telephoned Inspector Craddock first, then Dr. Haydock, Timothy Blackwood, Philippa Hames, and Miss Weatherby. To each, she extended the same invitation: tea at her cottage at 3 o'clock. There was, she explained, a matter of some importance to discuss regarding Mrs. Blackwood's death. Last of all, she telephoned the vicarage and spoke with Mrs. Clement. "I do hope you and the vicar can join us," she said pleasantly. "I believe we may finally get to the bottom of this distressing business." "Of course, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement replied, her voice betraying no emotion. "The vicar is visiting a parishioner in hospital this afternoon, but I shall certainly come." By 2:30, Miss Marple had arranged her sitting room to her satisfaction. Florence had polished the silver tea service, and fresh scones were warming in the oven. On a small side table, Miss Marple placed several items: a theatrical program yellowed with age, a ball of wool with silver knitting needles thrust through it, and a small box that she had retrieved from the back of her bureau drawer. Inspector Craddock arrived first, looking both curious and somewhat skeptical. "I do hope you haven't brought everyone here on a wild goose chase, Miss Marple," he said, as he settled into an armchair. "Not at all, Inspector," she replied calmly. "I believe we shall see the matter resolved quite satisfactorily today." The others arrived in quick succession: Dr. Haydock, looking professionally detached; Timothy Blackwood, elegantly attired, but clearly uncomfortable; Philippa Hames, her lovely young face drawn with strain; and Miss Weatherby, fluttering with excitement at being included in such a dramatic gathering. Mrs. Clement was the last to arrive, precisely at 3 o'clock. She was dressed with her usual neat propriety, but there was a tightness around her eyes that had not been there before. "How kind of you to have us all, Miss Marple," she said, taking the seat furthest from the door, her back to the window. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, distributing cups and offering scones with the practiced ease of a woman who had been entertaining in this fashion for decades. Only when everyone was served did she set down the teapot and regard the assembled company with her mild blue eyes. "I've asked you all here," she began, "because I believe the time has come to explain the true circumstances of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's death. Inspector Craddock has been most diligent in his investigation, but there are certain aspects of the case that I believe I may be able to illuminate." Miss Weatherby gave a small squeak of excitement, but subsided when Dr. Haydock frowned at her. "The central puzzle of this case," Miss Marple continued, taking up her knitting, "has always been the matter of the knitting. You see, when Mrs. Blackwood was found dead, she was working on a complex pattern known as the lover's knot. Yet the day before, at our knitting circle, she had claimed to be unfamiliar with complex patterns and was working on a simple scarf. Her needles clicked rhythmically as she spoke, her eyes moving from face to face. This suggested to me that the scene of her death had been arranged. She was not killed while knitting, rather someone positioned her body afterward, placing the knitting in her hands to create a particular impression. "But why would anyone do that?" Timothy Blackwood asked. "To create a false narrative," Miss Marple replied, "to make us believe that Mrs. Blackwood had been killed in a certain way, at a certain time. But there were inconsistencies. The knitting itself was too perfect, no dropped stitches, no hesitation marks that would naturally occur if someone had been surprised by an attacker, and her knitting bag was too neatly arranged, Not at all what one would expect after a violent struggle. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. So when do you believe she was actually killed? I believe she was killed earlier in the evening before she began knitting at all, and I believe her body was arranged afterward, with the knitting placed in her hands and the needle inserted into her neck post-mortem. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Clement sat very still, her teacup balanced precisely on its saucer. There is another curious aspect to this case, Miss Marple continued. The name of the knitting pattern, the Lover's Knot. It happens to be the same name as a theatrical production from 25 years ago, in which Elaine Blackwood starred, alongside a director named Richard Hames. Philippa Hames's head jerked up at the mention of her father's name. It was during this production that Elaine Blackwood and Richard Hames began their affair, an affair that would lead to scandal, to Richard Hames's suicide, and to Elaine Blackwood's withdrawal from the stage. Miss Marple paused, her knitting needles stilling. Or at least, that is the story, as it has been told all these years. She reached for the yellowed theatrical program on the side table. This program from that production was in Mrs. Blackwood's possessions. Inspector Craddock kindly lent it to me. The cast list makes for interesting reading. Elaine Blackwood played the lead, of course, but there are two other names that caught my attention. A minor role was played by one Helen Haydock. All eyes turned to Dr. Haydock, who nodded grimly. My sister, yes, she had theatrical ambitions in her youth. She rarely speaks of it now. Indeed, said Miss Marple. And there is another name here, in an even smaller role, Margaret Fitzwilliam. Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. A common enough name, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Quite so, agreed Miss Marple pleasantly, though it becomes more interesting when one considers that Richard Hames' wife was also named Margaret, and that the solicitor Mrs. Blackwood had summoned on the day of her death was a Mr. Fitzwilliam. The room had gone very quiet. Inspector Craddock was watching Mrs. Clement intently now. I believe, Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle but with an underlying firmness, that Margaret Hames did not simply fade into obscurity after her husband's suicide and the scandal with Elaine Blackwood. I believe she changed her appearance, took her maiden name Fitzwilliam, and eventually married a respectable clergyman who knew nothing of her past. I believe she became Mrs. Clement. Mrs. Clement had gone very pale, but her expression remained composed. This is absurd, she said. I never knew Richard Hames or Elaine Blackwood. I met Miss Clement in Somerset, where I was working as a parish secretary, and yet, Miss Marple continued, as if she hadn't heard the interruption. There is a photograph in the vicarage showing a theatrical production, the very production we've been discussing. When I remarked upon it, you claimed it belonged to your husband because of his interest in the theatre. But Mr. Clement has often mentioned to me that he finds the theatre frivolous and has never had any interest in it. Mrs. Clement's lips thinned. A minor mistruth to cover an embarrassing past. I was briefly on the stage, yes, but it has nothing to do with this case. I think it has everything to do with it. Miss Marple countered. You see, when Eleanor Blackwood moved to St. Mary Mead and established herself at Gossington Hall, she recognized you, didn't she? Despite the changes in your appearance, despite the years that had passed, she knew who you really were. This is ridiculous, Mrs. Clement said, but her voice lacked conviction. And then there is the matter of the cameo brooch, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. The brooch that Mrs. Blackwood wore to our knitting circle and that later went missing from her body, a brooch with a distinctive dark blue background, set in silver. She opened the small box from the side table and withdrew a cameo brooch exactly matching that description. This brooch was found in the vicarage garden, Inspector, beneath Mrs. Clement's sitting-room window. My maid's young nephew was playing there yesterday and found it half buried in the soil. Inspector Craddock took the brooch, examining it closely. This certainly appears to match the description of Mrs. Blackwood's missing brooch. It was not Mrs. Blackwood's brooch originally, Miss Marple said quietly. It belonged to Margaret Hames, a gift from her husband Richard, which he later gave to Elaine Blackwood during their affair. When Mrs. Blackwood wore it to our knitting circle, she was sending a clear message to Mrs. Clement, a message that she knew her true identity. The room had grown so still that the ticking of Miss Marple's clock seemed thunderous. Then Mrs. Clement drew a long, shuddering breath. He gave it to her, she said, her voice barely audible. My husband gave her my brooch. I had thought it lost when I saw it around her neck at the knitting circle. After all these years, her voice trailed off, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Mrs. Clement, Inspector Craddock said carefully, are you admitting that you were once Margaret Hames? A strange smile touched Mrs. Clement's lips. Yes, Inspector. I was Margaret Hames, wife of the brilliant Richard Hames, who fell under the spell of that woman. She nodded toward the theatrical program. Elaine Blackwood, the great actress, the seductress. But your husband committed suicide, Philippa Hames said, her voice trembling. After the scandal with Mrs. Blackwood, Mrs. Clement turned to look at the young woman, really seeing her for the first time. You're Richard's daughter, she said softly. You have his eyes, yes, Philippa replied. I came here to confront Mrs. Blackwood, to understand what happened between her and my father. She didn't drive him to suicide, Mrs. Clement said, her voice suddenly stronger. That was never true. A shocked silence fell over the room. What do you mean? Philippa asked at last. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as Mrs. Clement seemed to gather herself. Richard didn't kill himself, she said. I killed him, gasps echoed around the room. Inspector Craddock half rose from his chair. I found them together, Mrs. Clement continued, her voice oddly detached. In our home, in our bed. I had suspected for weeks, but seeing them, something broke inside me. There was a paperweight on the bedside table, heavy crystal. I picked it up, and I struck him. Just once, but it was enough. And Elaine Blackwood, Inspector Craddock asked quietly. She ran, fled the house half-dressed, terrified. I arranged Richard's body afterward, made it look like suicide, left a note in his handwriting. I had always been able to imitate it perfectly. Everyone believed it. The scandal with Elaine was already public knowledge. It made the suicide story more plausible. Miss Marple nodded. And Elaine Blackwood left the stage immediately afterward, living quietly under her married name, which few people knew. Until she came here, Mrs. Clement said, to a St. Mary Mead, to my village, to my life, wearing my brooch. She recognized you, Miss Marple said, just as you recognized her, and she threatened to reveal the truth about your husband's death. She said it was time to set things right, Mrs. Clement said bitterly. After 25 years, she suddenly developed a conscience. She said she was going to tell Philippa the truth and go to the police. She would have ruined everything, my marriage, my life here, everything I've built. So you killed her, Inspector Craddock said. It wasn't a question. I went to Gossington Hall that evening. I told my husband I was visiting a sick parishioner. Mrs. Blackwood was waiting for me. She had the audacity to offer me tea, as if we were old friends catching up. She said she had written to Philippa, asking her to come the next day so we could all talk. She spoke about closures and healing old wounds. Mrs. Clement's voice had taken on a hard edge. I had brought spiked tea with me, in a thermos, an old trick from my theatrical days when we needed to calm our nerves. A few drops of her sleeping draught in the tea. She was known to have trouble sleeping. She never suspected. When she became drowsy, I took her silver knitting needle, and she made a quick, decisive gesture with her hand. And then you arranged the scene, Miss Marple said. You positioned her with the lover's knot pattern, a deliberate reference to the production where it all began, a final act of symbolism. Yes, Mrs. Clement seemed almost relieved to have the truth out at last. It seemed fitting, somehow, to end where it all began. But there were loose ends, Miss Marple continued. Miss Haydock had recognized both of you from those theatrical days. She knew the truth about Richard Hames's death, didn't she? She had suspected all along. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. My sister confided in me before she left for London. She had seen Mrs. Clement, or rather Margaret Hames, leaving the Hames residence that night, 25 years ago. She had always suspected the suicide story was false, but she had no proof. When she saw both women here in St. Mary Mead, she feared what might happen, and the solicitor, Mr. Fitzwilliam, Inspector Craddock asked. My brother, Mrs. Clement admitted. He helped me after Richard's death, creating the new identity as Margaret Clement. When Elaine Blackwood contacted him about changing her will, he recognized the name and warned me she was planning to reveal everything. Philippa Hames had been listening with growing horror. So my father was murdered, she said, her voice barely a whisper, and I've spent my life believing he abandoned us by taking his own life. Mrs. Clement looked at her with something like regret. He would have abandoned you anyway, she said. He was planning to leave us for Elaine. He told me so that night before. She trailed off, unable to finish. Inspector Craddock stood and formally cautioned Mrs. Clement, who received the warning with remarkable composure. As he prepared to escort her from the cottage, she paused by Philippa Hames's chair. I am sorry, she said quietly. Not for what I did to your father. He betrayed me completely. But for what it did to you. You deserved better than either of us as parents. After Mrs. Clement had been taken away, the others gradually dispersed, each lost in their own thoughts about the revelations of the afternoon. Eventually, only Miss Marple and Timothy Blackwood remained. How did you know? He asked, watching as she calmly resumed her knitting. When did you first suspect Mrs. Clement? There were several small indicators, Miss Marple replied. Her reaction to the photograph was one. The missing brooch was another. She couldn't bear to see Elaine Blackwood wearing it, a constant reminder of her husband's betrayal. But what convinced me was her alibi for the night of the murder. She claimed to have been visiting a sick parishioner, but Miss Weatherby saw her near Gossington Hall, and when I inquired discreetly among the parish, no one had received a visit from her that evening. It seems so strange, Timothy mused. Two women bound together by a decades-old tragedy, finding themselves in the same small village after all those years. Not so strange, perhaps, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking rhythmically. Your aunt chose St. Mary Mead deliberately, you know. She had discovered Mrs. Clement's true identity and came here specifically to confront her. Perhaps she truly did want to set things right, or perhaps she simply couldn't resist the drama of the situation. She was an actress, after all, and now they're both gone, Timothy said sadly. My aunt to her grave, and Mrs. Clement to prison. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. A tragedy for all concerned, especially for that poor girl Philippa, who came seeking the truth about her father, only to discover something far worse than she had imagined. She held up her knitting, examining the pattern critically. You know, the trouble with complex patterns is that one small mistake early on can distort the entire work. Mrs. Clement made such a mistake 25 years ago and has been trying to knit over it ever since. But eventually such flaws always show themselves. Timothy Blackwood rose to leave. At the door he turned back. Will Philippa be all right, do you think? Miss Marple considered the question. In time, perhaps. The truth, however painful, is always preferable to illusion in the end. She's young and there's a strength in her that reminds me of her father, the good parts of him, the talent and vitality. She'll find her way. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat alone by her window, watching as the afternoon light slanted golden across her garden. The case was solved, the pattern complete, yet there remained as always the sadness that accompanied her solutions, the recognition of human frailty, of passions pushed to destructive ends, of lives tangled beyond redemption. One must be so careful with one's stitches, she murmured to herself as twilight began to gather. For once a pattern is set, It's very difficult to unravel without destroying the whole work. Her knitting needles continued their steady rhythm as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, a village that would soon return to its usual tranquility, the ripples from Eleanor Blackwood's death gradually fading until they became just another tale to be whispered over teacups, another lesson in the endless complexity of human nature that Miss Marple understood so well. The end.